Last but not least, the final presentation this morning. Tone is also well known here in Denmark, professor and head of studies at the University of Oslo. And you have done some relevant research lately on this issue, evidence-based practice in education. It's also published, and I think you will have a seminar about this issue tomorrow, actually. So hopefully a lot of people will join this as well. And you point out that many kinds of evidence are needed to make a decision whether a method of instruction will work in one's local context. And you will talk about evidence-informed professional judgment today. Please, Tone.
There we go. I would like to begin by thanking Aarhus for inviting me to speak at this conference. I'm actually quite honored to be here. Now, I come from an analytical tradition, which should nicely, I think, complement the two presentations that we have already heard, because they cover the real big issues and questions, whereas now it's time to dig into some more material and more details. So that's what I'm going to try to do. And Andreas, it would be great if you help me keep time. Yeah, thank you. This is what I'm going to do. I'm going to speak about judgment, about evidence, and about how evidence can inform judgment. I regret to say that I'm actually invited to speak about evidence, but that's the topic I'm going to say the least about. Yeah. Professional judgment is a diverse field. There are many perspectives, many standpoints, many problems, and there are ramifications in all directions, as we have already demonstrated. There is not one way to speak about this issue. There are many ways of speaking about it. And the different ways of speaking about it are adequate for different purposes, I would like to say by way of introduction. So I'm going to talk about professional judgment and evidence, which means I shall touch upon evidence-based practice, as has already been touched upon. But the way I'm going to do this requires that I make certain distinctions first. For example, professional judgment in itself is a huge and monolithic term, and it needs to be unpacked. And my particular unpacking of it here is tailored to a discussion of the possible role of evidence. So that's going to be my third issue. So we'll have to run through some material before we get to that. So judgment, some notes. All practitioners can and must exercise judgment. Their jobs are specialized, but they are also undetermined in the sense that there are no clearly defined boundaries that could tell you what an appropriate action might be. In fact, there might be several appropriate actions in one and the same situation. Routines are fine, but they only take you this far. So this is just to establish the necessity of judgment. Judgment is sometimes talked about as an ability. You see, there is this ambiguity in the term. It's an ability that we have to evaluate the situation, assess evidence, come to a reasonable decision without following rules. This is something we exercise. When we speak about judgment as an ability, we speak about it as something we exercise. But at the same time, judgment is also the product or the outcome of the exercise of this ability. And we speak about it as a product when we say, well, I judge that, or it is my judgment that. Usually, this is not confusing at all. It's usually very easy to tell from the context whether we speak about an ability, whether we speak about an outcome. So normally this causes no confusion at all. So this is just by way of beginning to unpack the term judgment. So, you can't make judgments willy-nilly. There are different types of boundaries that frame the judgments that we all make, and these are important to remember. So professional judgments are not made in a vacuum. There are certain boundaries or frames around them, as has already been touched upon. So there are normative restrictions that the judgment must heed. For example, what the aims are, what we try to achieve, the purposes of things. There are contextual features that will constrain the judgment that you can make in a given situation. Institutional factors that will impinge on your judgment, such as what's the headmaster going to think about this, for example. So these can be very practical issues. I'm coming back to that. Now, these restrictions and boundaries actually are of themselves a judgment that you make. I judge that these are the boundaries that I will have to make this judgment within. It's kind of a meta judgment, sort of. And I would just like to comment here that there's no need to set the frames or the boundaries too narrow for oneself. This is also about how you, as a practitioner, professional, perceive the space of action that you have accessible for you. And sometimes we see that people tend to make this space rather much smaller than it actually is, because the contextual features or boundaries are actually further out than people assume sometimes. So there's no need to set the frames too tightly for oneself. Usually there is more scope than one might think. And further, of course, there is existing knowledge, there are research results that one might use when one makes one judgment, and there is experience around. Personal experience or the experience of your colleagues. So, forms of judgment. Judgment comes in many different forms and shapes. And we exercise our ability with different intentions. And so my examples here are all come in addition to the ones that you have already seen in the two previous presentations. I'd like to start with the term professional discretion, which I have to admit only quite recently came to my attention. But there is this tendency that now that one actually leaves the term judgment behind and it begins to prefer the term discretion instead. So I have taken it here from Ronald Dworkin, who's a legal philosopher, and what he means by professional discretion is that a practitioner is charged with making decisions that are subject to standards set by a particular authority. So that's where the normative restrictions and the contextual / institutional restrictions or constraints come from. A practitioner charged with making decisions subject to standards set by a particular authority. But within that, you have quite a good leeway. And this he calls discretion, professional discretion. It's really hard to see what the difference is between discretion and judgment, but some people do insist that there is a certain and interesting and important conceptual difference between them. I think that's really up to anybody's own discretion, what they think about that. Now, different forms of judgment or discretion, if you like. Much judgment is a form of reasoning. For example, epistemic reasoning or diagnostic, if you like, where you look at a situation and you take in a lot of data about it, you make your observations, and then you come to a conclusion about what is going on here. So my judgment is that what's happening here is that such and such and such and such. That's an epistemic, appraisive or diagnostic form of judgment, which is you reason about what you see, and you come to a conclusion about what's going on. Then we have judgments, that is a form of reasoning toward making a decision, namely toward what should I do. I'm going to come back to that because my example is about that. You have judgments that are evaluations. Concerning statements, actions, state of affairs, for example. Concerning statements, you make the judgment, for example, that a statement is true, or that a statement is half true, or that is false, or that it's sensible, makes sense, or that it makes no sense. All of these are judgments that you make about claims, statements, theories, beliefs. We make judgments about actions. For example, that an action is adequate in the situation, that it was inadequate in the situation, that it was morally right, that it was morally wrong, or what have you. So we make all these judgments about actions. And then we make actions about state of affairs. We might, for example, judge that this state of affairs is normal, or this state of affairs is very untypical. That's a judgment we make. We may judge state of affairs to be desirable. We may judge it to be undesirable. We may judge it to be fair, unfair, etc., etc., etc. So we make all these evaluative judgments. Let me see what I have here. These judgments are very complex. In fact, I shall argue that when we make judgments, we put together lots of different sorts of information. We weigh this information together, we look at it and weigh it together and try to put it together as best as we can, and then we come to a conclusion of sorts. And this conclusion is when we say, well, my judgment is that. Then we have weighed all these different kinds of information together and landed on something. We've come to a conclusion. Needless to say, this is hugely complex. And equally needless to say, we do it effortlessly every day, all of us. God knows how many judgments we, each and all of us, make every day of all these kinds and forms. Judgments, if we look at them, they may be good or bad. They may be justified or unjustified. They may be brilliant. They may be disastrous. It's possible to make disastrous judgments. They may be adequate or inadequate. And actually, we judge the quality of judgments. For example, against criteria, or against situational features, or whatever we see, we judge are the sort of sensible criteria to use, or the sensible things to look at when we make our judgments about the quality of our own judgments, or the judgments of other people, for that matter. It is the case for professional practitioners that the welfare of others depend on the judgments they make, which leads into huge questions about accountability and responsibility and that sort of thing. But I actually think I'm going to leave the real big questions to Gert and to Lars. Yeah. So I'm letting that just trail off into the sand without saying anything else about it. Let me see. Yeah. Contextual, institutional, and normative constraints are important. This goes back to Dworkin and his professional discretion again. Dworkin and others, in fact, argue that the fact that professional judgments do have contextual, institutional, and normative constraints is definitional of professional judgment. That is, these constraints are precisely what makes a judgment a professional judgment. And that must be so, they argue, to distinguish professional judgment from imagination. If you had no constraints on your judgments, you could judge anything, right? But you can't if you're a professional practitioner. So these constraints, they would argue, are sort of built into the concept of professional judgment to distinguish it from mere imagination and flight of fancy. Okay, so that was number one. I'm off to my topic number two, which is evidence. Like I said, this is going to be very stepmotherly. I apologize to Lars, because this is what he actually asked me to talk about, so, but I'm going to do this very stepmotherly. Evidence. Evidence is an epistemological concept. It belongs to the philosophical realm of epistemology. That means to say that evidence belongs in the same philosophical landscape as terms such as justification, beliefs, knowledge, reasons, truth, confirmation, justification, etc., etc. So evidence belongs in that kind of landscape. Basically, no, I'll retract. I'm going to start that sentence again. It is the case historically that the term evidence has changed its content, like most concepts actually do, over a course of 1,000 years or so. But today, if you look at epistemological theory today, there is as much agreement as epistemologists are able to have that evidence is actually a servant. Evidence is that which we use to confirm or disconfirm our claims, or beliefs, our theories, our statements. So evidence is something that stands in a relation of support to some claim that we are making about the world. If you look at how we reason in our everyday lives, this is also how we tend to use the term. If we use the term, that's the role that it plays, that's the function that evidence does have. And what's really interesting here is the claim. It's the claim that we want evidence for that is central, not really the evidence itself, because evidence is a servant. So whenever you make a claim and somebody asks you, how do you know that? And then you say, well, I know that because we have data that points in that direction. We have so and so much data that supports this claim. Then you are justifying your claim by referring to evidence. We know this because we have evidence that suggests that this is actually so. So one must always distinguish between the evidence and the claim that the evidence is evidence for. Those are not the same. Evidence is that which speaks to the truth value of the claim. It's that which allows you to judge whether the claim is true or not, or false. It is that which you appeal to when you judge whether a claim is acceptable or not. To what degree a claim is acceptable is, of course, a matter of epistemic judgment. There are absolutely no algorithms for when people think we have enough evidence. No rules. It's judgment. So we are mostly interested in the claim, actually. Evidence is that which helps us to judge this claim. Is it true? Is it false? Is it believable? Is it acceptable? Or what have you. So evidence is a function. The term evidence points to this particular support function. And in principle, evidence is anything that can perform that function. For example, qualitative data, quantitative data, logical reasons, reconstruction of timelines, bloody footprints. I mentioned these bloody footprints because I happen to be a great reader of crime. I love crime. There's a whole lot of interesting things to be learned from reading crime, actually. So, bloody footprints, credit card receipts, and personal experience. Personal experience can function as evidence. That all depends on what sort of claim you want evidence for. Not all kinds of evidence can be evidence for all kinds of claims. In evidence-based practice, we have, or they have, what's called an evidence hierarchy. This ranks types, the different hierarchies, but they all rank evidence. And usually they rank quantitative evidence on top, that is evidence coming from randomized controlled trials, and meta-analyses on top, and personal experience and practitioner judgment at the bottom, with the implication that randomized controlled trials evidence, RCT evidence, is trustworthy and professional judgment is not trustworthy. Because really what we should look at when we look at evidence is it trustworthy? That's what you want with evidence. You want it to be trustworthy, because you can't use bad or weak or untrustworthy evidence to support a claim. So you have to judge the quality of the evidence. Can I use this evidence to support this claim? Is this evidence of high enough, good enough quality? Of course, that is a judgment, and people make different judgments about that. They have different standards as to how sort of high quality they demand. Some demand very high, and others have lower standards on that. In evidence-based practice, the hierarchy does have some justification because the claims that one wants evidence for in EBP is causal claims. And when you want causal claims, the data that are the best, so it is argued, are the data that come out of randomized controlled trials. But it's a mistake to generalize the evidence hierarchy and say that this holds for all types of evidence. It obviously does not. I should like to say this about evidence-based practice before I leave evidence here. Evidence-based practice is, they do want randomized controlled trials. That's what they want. And this they want because EBP is not really geared toward practice. It's geared toward research. So the name is very misleading in different ways. Because what one is doing when one is performing a randomized controlled trials is that you're finding causes. But finding causes, what researchers do, is very, very different from using causes, which is what practitioners are doing. And that is very blurred in EBP. So I argue anyway. Okay, I'm on to number 3 now. How can evidence inform judgment? Well, depends on the type of judgment that you're after, obviously. Here, I am going to take an example, and I think this is a bit untidy, what I'm about to say now, so I apologize for that in advance. I feel this is jumping a little back and forth here. But my example is reasoning toward a judgment about what to do. Now, suppose I am a teacher. I observe that my students lag behind. They are reading delayed, some of them. What should I do? What should I do? I have here normative and contextual boundaries. The normative is, well, I am a teacher. I must do something to help my students improve their reading skills, because that's part of the aim of what I'm going to do. It has been a basic educational aim as long as schools have existed, teach students to read, write, and calculate. So that's a normative boundary. Here's the controversial issue: the use of quantitative RCT evidence in education. Because quantitative data do not tell you what to do. They do not and cannot tell you what to do. So what can they do for us? Well, they play an indirect role in your judgment, I am going to argue. So going to place RCT evidence, quantitative research-based evidence, in a chain of reasoning, namely a chain of or judgment, if you like. In addition, when we reason towards what to do, we find a different type of evidence, namely the observation that my students are lagging behind. My students are reading delayed. Now, this second type of evidence, the observations I make, are actually the starting point for my reasoning. That's where I get my problem from. I observe my students. I observe that some of them are reading delayed. That's where my reasoning starts. And from this ground, here's my example. I observe that my students are reading delayed. What should I do? From my observations of reading delay, I conclude that, well, perhaps I should do what I did last year. That worked well enough, I might tell myself. Or maybe I should ask my colleague who is educated, whose education on this is better than mine, ask her advice. Or maybe I should try Hatcher's method for improving grammatical skills. So different courses of action are compatible with my starting point here. It's not one thing that I have to do. I have different courses of action that I can choose between. And the starting point is thus both normative and empirical, because it contains the aim. Yes, it's my job to teach all my students to read properly, and it contains the observation that some of them are reading delayed. So this is contextual data. This is contextual data. This is what Michael Eraud calls practice-based evidence. It's the evidence that comes out of the context by observation. But even this kind of contextual data should be justified, because it's possible to observe wrongly and it's possible to interpret observations wrongly. Okay, so I tell myself, I'll try doing X. And then maybe I have a colleague who comes and asks me, well, why do you think that X is a good thing to do here? So that's a challenge to me as the practitioner to justify my step from observation to conclusion that I should do X. Well, this is the warrant. I have to warrant my step. And I say, well, X usually helps students. We've had students like this before, and what we did then usually helps them. Usually helps for students with this kind of reading problem. And then my colleague asks, well, how do you know that? How do you know that X usually helps students? And then I might say, well, I actually know that because there are 5 good RCTs, and they all suggest that this method works well for this kind of student. So this is where the RCT comes into your reasoning when you're reasoning toward a judgment about what to do. It serves as a backup to your step from the starting point to the conclusion. I'm almost done. Yeah, good. Oh, good. So, the argument. Research evidence comes in after your reasoning is well underway, and it can be used to justify or bolster your decision, your judgment, namely that method X is a reasonable remedy for the problem that I have observed. Thus, research evidence plays an indirect part. It informs your judgment, but it does not instruct you. It does not tell you exactly what to do, but it serves to justify and back up your judgment. Conclusion. It is important to be aware that different kinds of evidence enters into the reasoning process, which leads you toward a judgment of sorts, and that this different types of evidence comes in at different stages in your reasoning process. You start out with the contextual I have suggested, and then the research evidence comes in at the later stage when you need to justify your judgment. So different kinds of evidence come in at different stages in your reasoning process. And they do perform different functions in your judgment. Contextual data is the springboard, is what sets your reasoning going. Research data serves to justify, so they perform different functions at different stages in your reasoning. This does not mean that ethical considerations are precluded. You could stop and think for a moment on the way and ask yourself, well, are there side effects of this method that we know about? Things like that. And then there are, so that's also kind of evidence, or information, if you like. And then there are all these practical matters. Practical matters are actually very important. Do I know the method well enough? Can I really implement this properly? Do I have the resources that it takes to implement this method? Does it, for example, rely on parental supports? So do I have the parents on board? If the method requires that my students read 1 hour extra at home every evening, do I have the parents with me? If not, it might not work. Yeah? These are very practical matters, and they concern the context that you're operating within. These are facts on the ground, and they are a form of evidence, contextual evidence, that enter into your reasoning. And then finally, you put all these different kinds of information together, and you come to an all things considered judgment, and you conclude for yourself, okay, I am going to try Hatcher's method for enhancing grammatical skills for my students, and then see if that works. All things considered judgments are fantastically interesting because there is always this sort of something a little bit mysterious about them. Well, have you really included all things? Are you sure there are not more things one can include in this? This is what we in Norwegian call helhetlig vurdering. And I always ask myself, yes, have you think you've considered it all? Have you gotten the whole? So there's always this sort of mysterious element to all things considered judgments. And you can consider as many things as you know of, but that doesn't make your decision infallible. Your judgment might turn out to be inadequate after all, even though you've put all this effort into safeguarding it. So there are no guarantees for anything in professional life. That makes professional life interesting, and it also makes research interesting, I would like to say. Thank you.